Welcome to the Agent of Wealth podcast with Marc Bautis from Bautis Financial. In this podcast, Marc helps guide you towards financial freedom, ensure you never run out of money, and create a balance in life that prioritizes what is most important to you. Join us for this journey as Marc draws from years of expertise and guest experts to solve the multiple wealth building challenges involved in your financial life.
Welcome back to the Agent of Wealth. This is your host, Marc Bautis. On today's show, I brought on a special guest, Chris Donaldson. Chris is a world traveler and the author of the book Going the Wrong Way, a coming-of-age self-help book about a road trip like no other. This year, 42 years after his first journey, Chris is setting out on another adventure across the world. Today, we'll talk about the power of travel and reasons to journey around the world in retirement. Chris, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Mark. It's nice to be here.
So let's talk about your first journey 42 years ago. What made you want to ride around the world back then?
Well, if you remember back when you're young, you think you can do anything and nothing is impossible. And the stupider it is, the better it is to do sometimes. So it made sense to me. I grew up in Belfast in the 60s and 70s. And the troubles were in full spate. I went to school in the centre of Belfast. You could see bombs going off through the lunchtime break windows. Bomb scares galore. It was a very peculiar time to grow up for a kid. We didn't notice anything wrong at the start because really when you're a kid you don't know anything else, so you just think that's normal. But once you realise that the rest of the world doesn't live like this, I suppose it was one of the reasons I decided to get out. When I finished school in Australia, Irish people either go to Australia or America, as you know. I think it's a lot more Irish people in America than there is in Ireland now. So I decided to ride a bike to Australia. It took me a couple of years to plan it. Plan my route, where I was going, how I would get there, would ride to India, and then take a boat from India to Australia, stay there for a couple of months and go to the States, or stay in Australia. But the book's called Going the Wrong Way because I got to London from Belfast, which isn't very far, and the Ayatollah Khomeini decided to take over the American embassy in November 79 with the revolution. So that basically closed the door east. So I was stuck with somewhere. I left home, had to go somewhere. I couldn't go back home, so I decided to go south, follow the sun. Went down to Greece, over to Israel, thinking I could get from Israel into Egypt. Of course, I couldn't do that at that stage. Ended up going back through Syria, which was pretty scary. Something similar to it is at the minute. And through Jordan into Egypt that way. Across the Sahara, down through Uganda. Africa was a pretty dodgy spot at the time. Idi Amin just got out of Uganda. Rhodesia had a civil war. It's now Zimbabwe. Even Kenya and Tanzania, the border was closed, so there was a lot of sort of trouble and strife going on. So it quite a hairy trip down to South Africa, which of course was in the middle of apartheid. So basically I went from having a carefully planned sort of 3-month jaunt to Australia to a completely sort of chaotic journey down Africa. And at one stage I actually drove off the edge of my map, not knowing what was on the other side. South Africa managed to hitch a ride on a yacht and got a yacht race back to Europe and got the bike sent to the States, to Los Angeles. Spent 6 months in the States touring around up to Canada and across and down to North Carolina, Florida, and then on down to South America. So it was quite encompassing a lot of countries in the world apart from the ones that I originally intended to go to. It took about a year and a half, and it was quite a, as I say, coming of age trip. I was 21 years old. I'd been away from home a couple of times, but nothing like. It was a baptism of fire, seeing how the world is run and what happens elsewhere. And I guess if one thing I learned in Northern Ireland, the troubles were not quite so bad as I thought they were. There's a lot worse places in the world.
Did you return to Northern Ireland after the trip?
Yeah, I did. I mean, I ran out of money and I got sick. I caught hepatitis in South America and the bike was in bits at the end of the trip as well. So I flew home, intending not really with a plan, just at that stage, just got a job in a family business, which seemed like a good idea to start in with anyway. So I spent the next, I suppose, 40 years working in the family business, taking it over, prospering well enough until the credit crunch, so 10, 15 years ago. We had a bit of financial trouble. The banks took over my properties, took over the business. Spent 3 years of work and self-litigation to get them back again. And it was really at that stage I probably realised that one thing that the travelling had taught me was travelling my own, fighting my way through various dictatorships and troubles, was that if you want something along well enough, you want to make your mind up to get there, you can do it. Certainly gave me realised that what I'd learnt on that journey had actually forged the way I developed myself and the way it worked and the way my personality was for the last 30 years since the trip. And I was able to finally realise that it made me the man I was, if you like. It doesn't sound too corny.
And that trip, you did it by yourself, or were you with someone?
I did it by myself. I find travelling by yourself is much more beneficial, if you like, than travelling with somebody else, because if you're somebody else, and the more people you're with, you're less in line. The more there are with you, the less inclined you are to actually meet other people along the way. And the whole idea of travelling is not just to see the sights, it's also to meet the people and learn new cultures and learn what's happening in the places you're going through. So if you want to do, the way it's a bit force feeding, you have to, if you're on your own, if you want to talk to somebody, you have to find somebody to talk to and make yourself much more open and available to local people. And generally around the world, you find that people will talk to you if you're on your own. You're less threatening if you're on your own, especially on a motorbike as well. Motorbike's a great way of breaking the ice with people. Everybody either likes motorbikes or hates them, but usually they like them, and it's a good conversation starter with people.
And when you were planning, how did you think about the finances or paying for it? Did you put a budget together, or did you kind of just wing it and say, you know what I have, and this is what I'm going to leave the house with?
Well, pretty much. I think I had about £1,000 put together, which is probably about $4 or $5 grand now, which is not really an awful lot to live on for 3 or 4 months. But I thought that would get me to Australia okay, which it would have, because it would only take me 3 or 4 months, as I say. The plan would have been to sell the bike in Australia and get a job and possibly stay there. It would have been open for anything at that stage at 21. My main problem with the route I did take, it took me 1.5 years. Although it did work along the way a wee bit. The shortage of money was always quite dramatic. So one of the biggest problems I had was actually living like the locals in Africa. You can live very cheap in some of these places. But if you're camping out, living like a local, sofa surfing.
Yeah. So now, I guess it was about 4 years ago, you decided, let me actually put this to words, put these memories or this recollection of the journey to words, and that's how you started the book?
Yeah, I mean, it was about 60, coming 60. A lot of friends were retiring, and I was rewinding my business down a bit, trying to look at ways to take more time. But when I looked around, my friends had taken early retirement, I really didn't like what I saw. People seem to think that the whole idea of working for 30 or 40 years was that you could do nothing all day. Just veg out in front of the TV, play golf a couple of times a week, work in the garden. It really didn't seem that attractive that you worked 40 hours a week for 40 years to basically be unemployed and not have an awful lot of money either compared to when you were working. So one of the things I decided to do was learn how to write a book, set myself a challenge to write a book. I never did very well at school. I flunked my English language a couple of times, I'm sure. So I had to learn how to go around writing a book. Having the story is only part of it. It's getting it down into words and into words that people enjoy reading.
Did you journal during the trip, or when you started this book 4 years ago, you had to basically remember everything from memories?
No, I was lucky enough or unlucky enough, whichever way you look at it. I did journal everything as I went along, and when I got back, I'd actually started putting it into a manuscript. But about 6 months after I got back, somebody brought me a book that somebody else had written. A guy called Ted Simon had written a book called Jupiter's Travels, and he'd practically done the same journey I'd done, only he'd gone farther before me. He was 40-odd years old. He was a journalist, a writer, and he'd written a very good book, which I thought I'll never be able to replicate that. So I basically gave up at that stage and put my notes and everything else in the drawer and just forgot about it. So it was very interesting pulling the notes out again, reading my notes that I'd written when I was 22 as a 60-odd-year-old and putting myself back in the brain, as I say, if I had the thought processes that were going through my head then when I wrote those notes. So I tried to write the book with that as a 22-year-old, a 21-year-old, rather than as a 60-year-old, which was quite interesting. Thinking the same way as you thought 40 years ago.
Yeah.
But the interesting thing was the things that I'd forgotten or I'd thought I'd forgotten. Whenever you read about them in a diary or in a journal, they come back a bit, and then you start writing about it and looking at the photographs that you took at that stage. And it's like scraping paint off an old piece of wood. The story's still there underneath all the paint, but it's just been, the brain's covered it up with 40 years of things that have gone on, which sort of covered up what's in there. But it was amazing how much I actually did remember back again, and how even I felt like in the middle of Africa or in the middle of South America or somewhere like that. It was amazing how it all came back. Not all of it, obviously you can't remember what people said and so on, but an awful lot came back that they needed to do to write the book.
In those 40 years since, have you ever been back to any of the places that you went to on that initial journey?
I've been back to America a few times, good few times. I've been to South Africa a couple of times as well, but not really, because I think if you go somewhere the second time, you're generally not going to enjoy it as much as you did the first time. It's like going on holiday, you have a great time, you go back the next year and it's just not the same. And the reason it's not the same is that people aren't the same and you're not the same, and whatever you liked about it the time before maybe isn't just the same either. So I think it can be quite dangerous expecting the same thing to be happening again. I have read about people journeying along the same lines that they've done before, and I think very often it's a disappointment. Maybe you just imagined it was better at the time than you were there before, but when I was going away this trip, I decided to go a completely different direction. Generally, I think it's better not to cover the old ground again.
So you're thinking about doing another adventure to try and get to Australia?
Well, a couple of years ago, one of my mates read my book and he says, "This great book, really enjoyed it, but you never actually got to Australia. What about having another go at it?" So I looked down as well. I can't really do that. I've got a 15-year-old daughter. I've got a job. I've got a wife, family. How do you just disappear for 3 months at a time? You can't do that. So we just decided to break it down in stages and basically we'd go away for 2 weeks at a time. And I took the same motorbike I travelled on 40 years ago. So we got it done up, and Liam he bought a new Moto Guzzi. Mine's an old Moto Guzzi Le Mans. They're Italian motorbikes. So we went down to Greece first of all, parked up in a local dealer there, left them there for a couple of months. Came back in between COVID was another added bit of excitement to throw in the mix.
How long does it take to get from Ireland to Greece?
Well, it's about 2,000 miles, so you can do it in a week quite nicely.
Okay, yeah, that's pretty close.
Yeah, it's not too far. So we parked up in Greece in the local Moto Guzzi dealers, then came back last November and took the bikes over to Israel with the intention of going to Jordan and into Saudi and into Dubai as the next stop. But we got to Israel and, well, they wouldn't let us cross the border into Jordan. There's the guy decided he didn't like our paperwork. So that was a bit of a deja vu. Talk about going back to the same place twice. When I went to Israel 40 odd years ago, I couldn't get out. I tried to get to Egypt and Israel and Jordan, and they wouldn't let me over the border. I came back this time and they still wouldn't let me out. So although I did meet a lovely experience, there was a guy I stayed with in Tel Aviv for 3 or 4 days. We got on very well with, but being kids in those days, I never kept his address. I did have his name. I'd never been in touch with him, but with the wonders of Facebook, one of my readers in Israel was able to track him down. So a guy called Alex we met up with in a wee Irish bar in Tel Aviv after 43 years, which is pretty cool. But so we went back to Greece, left the bikes there again, and that's when the problem started, because Liam decided that he didn't want to go on. He decided just to come home, which put me in a bit of a quandary because I'm not as young as I used to be. The bike was not as young as it used to be, and I didn't know if I had the wherewithal to cross some third world countries and Iran, places like that on my own. So I had to do a bit of soul searching there, and eventually decided I would give it a go and see how I got on. So I went back down to Athens and drove across to Turkey, which was quite interesting because it was freezing. It was end of March. I've been to Greece lots of times and it's beautiful. It's beautiful. It's like Florida. It's lovely weather, sunshine all the time. With 6 inches of snow, freak weather with global warming having all sorts of repercussions around the place. Went through Turkey into Iran, which was the bogeyman, if you like, and I was nervous about obviously what's going on at the minute. It's difficult for travellers, but it was one of the friendliest countries I've ever been to. It's a bit ironic. The places that you're most worried about, people couldn't be nicer. Every time you'd stop to ask directions, people would invite you into their house, invite you to stay. A couple of times even filling up with petrol. The guys beside me insisted on paying for my petrol. Whether it's because they've been isolated for so long, they wanted me to make up for their government or whatever, but it's certainly one of the friendliest countries I've ever been in. So I drove down to the south of Iran and over to Dubai, where I left the bike again. I lived for 8 years in Dubai when I was in my 50s. I worked there for a while, ran a little IT business, and I lived in a boat because I couldn't afford to pay the rent of the housing over there. It's like New York. It's ferocious. So I left the bike there For the next jaunt, came back for another few months. So one of the main reasons put people off doing a long journey like that would be the time it takes, but there's always a way around it. If you want, you can obviously cost a bit more the further you go away, the more the flights cost going back again. But you can actually ride around the world or drive around the world, whatever you want to do, in stages, just leaving your bike where you and come back to work. And you've also got your laptop, you can be in touch the whole time as well. One of the main differences, I suppose, between traveling now and 40 years ago is the communications. So much easier now with the internet, with GPS, with communications. You can book your hotel on booking.com or Airbnb, whatever. So Google Maps will tell you exactly where you're going, what the roads are going to be like, how long it's going to take you, which kind of takes a bit of the magic away from it a wee bit, because it sort of spoils the not knowing, but I suppose it's a wee bit safer. So the next leg, I just finished, we went from Dubai back to Iran and then to Pakistan. Pakistan was actually the hairiest place because I had to travel by police escort the whole way across, which was pretty hectic because they'd either be going at 18 miles an hour or 80 miles an hour, neither of which particularly suited me. But they were lovely people, but they have their problems from, I suppose, the spillover of the problems from Afghanistan. They've had a lot of trouble over the last 20 years. So I left the bike. That was the fifth leg in Pakistan, across India and into Nepal, where I left the bike and got it flown to the States, or flown to Australia, where it is now. So the bike's finally made it. After 43 years, it's finally got to Australia. And I'll be flying out in the new year sometime to finally complete that part of the journey. It's been a trial of, obviously for the bike, it's a trial of engineering that's kept going, but I'm not the fittest person. I've actually been diagnosed with Parkinson's a couple of years ago, which is probably one of the reasons I wanted to set myself a challenge as well. I wasn't going to let myself go down a slippery slope without fighting back as best I could, mentally and physically. I think it's, as they say in fitness, if you don't use it, you lose it. If you don't use your body, you'll deteriorate as you get older. And I think it's very true with your mind as well, with your memory and with the ability to think and work things out. But also mentally, I think it's important to have a challenge to learn something new. As you get older, you get tired, everything's more of an effort. And I think it's easy just to do things the easy way, the old way, the way you know. The trouble with that is you lose the inspiration or the interest in learning something new and trying something different, which I feel at 64 is vital to keep an interest, to keep your brain alive, keep your interests alive, to not fall into the can't be bothered routine that so many older people get into.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things I see is there's always the financial aspect of retirement, stopping working and this, but just as important is, what are you going to do with that time and how are you going to, do you have hobbies? And like you mentioned, you couldn't see yourself doing the, golf and tending to the garden, and, you want to do things that actually stimulated your mind or helped you grow. And I think that's a challenge too for people, is to find that aspect of retirement.
Yeah. And I do feel that myself, that the days you get up and you can't really be bothered doing too much and you haven't got the energy and you wonder where your energy's gone. And it is more of an effort to kick yourself in the ass and get out and do things. But I think it's vital to, as I say, not just for your physicality, but for your mental approach to life and to keep an interest in doing something that you find is difficult to do or maybe impossible to do, because it's by pushing yourself that extra bit to do that very difficult thing that you're going to keep stretching your brain power to challenge yourself,
Yeah. Do you plan on writing a book on this trip or a stage trip as well, or no?
Yes, I probably will. I'll probably make it more of a memoir of the story of my life as such, the different things that happened along the way. I haven't made so many mistakes. I've learned a few things in the last 60 years. I haven't made quite as many mistakes as I made when I was 21. There's no girls involved this time as well, so it's not going to be quite as interesting. But a different angle, obviously. It's, I suppose, the major sort of thing is, the first book was a coming of age story. This is I'm not sure what the actual wording is of leaving of age or finishing of age.
Yeah. Well, we're just about out of time. Chris, I want to thank you for being on the show today. Great inspiration on making the most of your time. It was really interesting hearing about your journey. How best can someone find out more about you, get a copy of the book?
Well, the book's available worldwide on Amazon, Going the Wrong Way by Chris Donaldson. It's got about 900 reviews so far, so it's going very well. It's getting a great reaction. I've got my website, chrisdonaldson.world, but certainly for the States, paperbacks and ebooks and the audiobook is available on Amazon. That company we love to hate. We can't do without them.
Yep. And we'll link to that in the show notes. And thanks again, Chris, for being on today, and thank you everyone for tuning in.
Thank you for listening to the Agent of Wealth podcast. Click the subscribe button below to be notified when new episodes become available. The information covered represents the views and opinions of the guests and does not necessarily represent the views or opinions of Bautis Financial. The content has been made available for informational and educational purposes only and is not intended to be a substitute for professional financial planning and investment advice. Always seek the advice of your financial advisor or other qualified financial service provider with any questions you may have regarding your investments and financial planning.